Hi there, I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. Very pleased to welcome you to today's session entitled Why Account Security Doesn't Stop at Login. Your presenters today are Alex Gardner, Product Marketing Manager at Human Security, and Uriel Maimon, Vice President, Emerging Products with Human Security. Now, before I turn this over to our presenters, let me give you some background on today's discussion. In today's world, relying on a single point in time security check is not enough to keep accounts secure. Determined attackers are sidestepping login security measures to compromise legitimate user accounts and create fake accounts to commit fraud and abuse. To counter these bad actors, organizations need continuous risk assessment of accounts over their life cycle, constantly examining them for signs of compromise and suspicious activity. In this session today, you'll learn why post-login security is so important for online accounts, what solutions need in order to provide that security, and how Human can help. Some background on Information Security Media Group. We are a global education and intelligence firm. We were started up 16 years ago. And of course, you might know us by one or more of our 34 media properties. These include Bank Info Security, Gov Info Security, and Data Breach Today. We serve an audience of over 1 million security leaders globally. We give them a daily diet of news, analysis, research, events, and academic programs just like this one. As always, just a few notes of housekeeping. One, if you have any questions for our panelists during the course of this session, submit them anytime via the chat window on your screen. I likely won't be able to get to every question before we end, but for those questions that we don't answer today, we will get a response back to you via email. Should you encounter any technical issues while viewing today's webinar, please take down that email address you see on your screen. If you write to webinars@ismg.io, we've got support staff standing by to help. Now, a reminder, today's webinar is copyrighted material. It's meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you'd like to use any of the information presented today, or if you're looking for customized training materials, do contact us, please. I am delighted to introduce our sponsor today, Human Security. Human uses modern defense to safeguard organizations from bot attacks and fraud, increasing ROI and trust while decreasing customer friction, data contamination, and cybersecurity exposure. Human collects more than 2,500 signals from every browser or mobile device that connects to your web application, crunches these data through more than 350 algorithms to proactively reach that single critical decision, bot or not. Human combines superior detection techniques, internet scale observability, and hacker intelligence to make bot or not decisions with no impact on page load times or friction on end users. With this scale and speed, you can mitigate today and tomorrow's sophisticated bots. Let's meet our panelists. Alex Gardner is a product marketing manager at Human. He focuses on safeguarding online accounts from fraud and abuse. With more than 7 years experience in cybersecurity, he previously worked in the endpoint security, EDR, and XDR spaces. Uriel Maimon, VP Emerging Products with Human, has got 25 years of experience in cybersecurity and enterprise software, specifically focusing on building new products. He's worked in early stage startups such as Zend, Lightsaber, and Fireglass. He's got experience working at scale in big companies such as Symantec, Checkpoint, and RSA. With that, let me turn you over now to Uriel and Alex. Gentlemen, the stage is yours, please.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Tom, for that generous introduction. My name is Alex Gardner, and I'm going to kick off this presentation. Now, we've got some really exciting content that we're going to be covering today. We're going to kick off talking a little bit about why account security is so important, the types of value that can be held in accounts, the types of pain points that can be experienced when those accounts get compromised or fake accounts are created. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why post-login visibility is so important, what your solution should offer and able to help you address that issue. And then finally, we're going to talk about how Human can help you solve some of these issues. So let's start with a bit of background on why accounts are targets and why it's an area of concern for many organizations. So on the left-hand side of this slide, looking at our circle here, we can see organizations that have been affected by a web or a mobile application attack. Now, as you can see, the vast majority of organizations, unfortunately, have experienced this type of attack, over 90%. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, we're looking at some of the top concerns around these types of attack. Now, straight away, you can see that account takeover and credential stuffing attacks are number 2 on this list of concerns. But I also want to draw to your attention that a lot of the other items on this bar chart are also potential consequences from having accounts being taken over, about having accounts compromised, and also from fake account creation. So, for example, carding and payment fraud attacks can also be a consequence of having an account being taken over. Then the bad actor, if there are any cards on file or any funds stored in there, they're going to try and take advantage of that. Personally identifiable information, PII harvesting, again, any sensitive information that's stored in an account is going to be stolen by that attacker. So there are lots of different pain points that your organization and organizations like yours may already be experiencing. So we're going to cover a few more examples of those slightly later on in this presentation.
I just wanted to point out something about personally identifiable information, which is that, at least in the United States, all 50 states have some kind of law in the books around data breaches and the liability of the companies whose databases are breached and have PII exfiltrated for them. Now, normally those laws are on the books with the thought of a hacker hacking in and stealing the entire database, but that's not how those laws are actually written. They're talking about the liability and obligations of a company in any situation where PII is exfiltrated from their data. And a few years ago, there was actually a seminal lawsuit in New York State where New York State Attorney General sued Duncan Brands around consequences of PII that was stolen during credential stuffing attacks and account takeover on their website. And it's notable that there wasn't necessarily any payment fraud or any attack that was happening on that website. It was just the exfiltration of information. And that eventually settled out of court, but there is a very strong understanding that these laws are going to be interpreted like this moving forward.
So I also just wanted to take a quick moment to really summarize just how much this type of attack is on the rise. So on the right-hand side of the slide, a headline we have here, social media account takeovers increased by over 1,000% in 2021. So unfortunately, we don't have stats for this year, but it's a really prevalent and massive increase that we're seeing in these types of account compromise attacks. And on the left-hand side, Microsoft actually recently published an article where they'd been experiencing attacks where users of the Outlook service had been getting compromised, even when they had MFA, multi-factor authentication, enabled. Now, the way the attackers were doing this was essentially using session jacking. So when the legitimate user had authenticated MFA, the attackers were then able to basically steal that session and log in as if they were the legitimate users. And then they were using these accounts as a springboard to launch phishing campaign attacks against other users and other organizations. So it's really a modern day problem that's only getting worse and can, in fact, bypass some traditional security systems that are very commonplace.
I think there's two very interesting things that we can learn from this particular use case of Microsoft. The first is the inherent tension between friction and security controls. And multi-factor authentication is a very, very good example. It's considered a gold standard, very strong security measure, but often it's non-practical to deploy to actual real customers due to the additional friction that it involves in the web browsing experience. And some websites have experienced as much as 20% abandonment rate due to multi-factor authentication, which is why, in this case, Microsoft had long-running sessions. So you don't frequently need to authenticate using multi-factor authentication, but only sporadically, which then, in the event that authentication session is stolen, means that it's valid almost indefinitely, which brings up the other key takeaway that I would take from this example, which is that often security controls in this instance, multi-factor authentication. There's a lot of buzz today about passwordless authentication. There is this grasp that a single security control will be the holy grail and solve the problem. And historically speaking, there is no actual proof that there is any such control that has ever worked in that fashion. Usually what we see when you deploy multi-factor authentication, which is a costly security control to implement, the attacks and the fraud may decline for a period of time, but then they come back and they just use different techniques. So instead of using credential stuffing attacks, you will see malware, you will see phishing attacks, you will see other ways to circumvent that control, which really kind of puts the spotlight on the importance of visibility and having multi-tiered security controls and the defense in depth strategy and a platform that is future compatible that allows you to react to the incessant arms race of the fight with attackers.
So let's just take a moment to think about what are your accounts worth to your organization. Now, often this discussion tends to start from a financial point of view. So when we think of accounts and their worth, often we're thinking about, is there a card on file? Is there monetary value or points that can be converted to goods or services or money itself within an account? And those are all obviously very important things to consider for the value of an account. But it could be much broader than that as well, depending on the type of account, the type of organization, the type of service that they're offering. So there are lots of different areas to consider. It may not be purely financial. So other things that may add value to your account can include things like promotions. So for example, if an organization has a service and a new account is given, say, a 2-week free trial access to that service, then there's value in there that can be exploited by fraudsters seeking to steal the value of that service from your organization, but then also they can resell those accounts to generate income for themselves as well. So here are just a few examples of the types of things. We talked about promotions, discount codes in a similar vein, digital credits, airline miles, again, things that can be exchanged for value, but also it can be a more holistic viewpoint as well. So things like the reputation of your service and your platform. If you're a service that thrives on user interaction and relies on users experiencing that process with you, anything that's going to negatively impact that can obviously have a very serious impact on your organization's bottom line by extension, because of that potential negative impact that, so for example, spamming malware or posting offensive content or being the target of phishing emails, or your accounts themselves being compromised, which reduces user confidence in your platform. So lots of different areas to consider when you're defining what your accounts are worth to you as an organization. So I like using this stat, and it's going to lead nicely into our next slide, is that often attacks on accounts can be framed purely in the automated bot angle. And yes, that is a very important angle to consider, but it's by no means the only one, as this stat goes to show. So 82% of breaches involve the human element, whether it's the use of stolen credentials, phishing, misuse, or simply an error. People continue to play a very large role in incidents and breaches alike. Now, you're going to see why as we talk a little bit now about how accounts themselves can get compromised. So we're going to start off actually with the more automated attacks, so things like credential stuffing and brute forcing. So credential stuffing is when a cyber criminal will use stolen credentials that they've acquired, for example, from another data breach, and they're going to use those usually in an automated process, so they can attempt lots of logins and credential usage at the same time, and they're going to try and automatically break into users' accounts using those stolen credentials. Brute forcing, along similar vein, it can either be using a partial credential, or they're attempting to break very weak passwords, for example, which is why you're always recommended to use a complex password, don't reuse passwords, that type of thing. Now, typically, these are performed via automated processes, such as a bot attack. And then our middle column is malware. So this is another avenue that's very commonplace in breaching accounts. So for example, if your mobile device, your laptop, your desktop becomes infected with malware. I'm sure everyone listening to this has heard of ransomware. It's unfortunately a very prominent form of malware. And ransomware works by dropping a payload on the device. It will then encrypt key files on that device so the user no longer has access to them. And then the attacker will attempt to ransom access back to those files. But quite often, there's a second payload drop that also exfiltrates any sensitive data that was stored on that device. So for example, login credentials or personally identifiable information, PII, which the attacker can then leverage to perform further attacks or resell on the dark web. And then our final example is phishing and social engineering. So again, I'm sure everyone listening in is very familiar with the traditional phishing email that's attempting to trick users into handing over details. Now, we've come a long way from the horrible grammar, error-prone emails. The types of phishing attacks emails you can see today can be very, very sophisticated, and you really have to examine closely to decide whether it's legitimate or not. And also, they become very proficient, attackers that is, have become very proficient at cloning web pages. So for example, a phishing email may point you to a web page that for all intents and purposes looks identical to the user's legitimate bank portal. So they would log in thinking, well, sorry, they'd type in their credentials thinking they were logging into their banking site. Really what they've just done is hand over their credentials on a silver platter to the attacker. And Yura is going to give us an example of some other techniques that are used here.
Yeah. So when you're talking about malware, a big reason why an attacker would choose to use malware rather than much cheaper techniques like phishing and credential stuffing is because of security controls. One of the big advantages of malware is that unlike credential stuffing, where you're using bots to check if credentials are valid or not, if you have a keylogger or a form grabber, a malware that steals password, then you're stealing them when you know that they're already valid. So you never need to test them. So you can skip over the automated stage and go right into the human stage of logging in with credentials that you know are valid. Likewise, another reason why you would use malware is because somebody has deployed a security control like multi-factor authentication, at which point stealing the username and password or stealing any piece of PII is not going to help because you have this dynamic third factor that changes all the time. But once you have a piece of software running on the machine, then you can steal essentially the results of the multi-factor authentication. So the way these things work online is that you have the multi-factor authentication, and once you successfully authenticate, you receive a security token. That's what happened in the Microsoft example we were talking about earlier, and that token can be stolen and then replayed from a different device. Or in extreme cases where that isn't possible, the attackers can actually use what's called RAT, remote access technology, take over the legitimate user's machine once authentication has already finished, and actually use their existing session in order to implant malicious transactions. This is often the case in banking situations where payments are injected into the flow of the legitimate user's session. And talking about phishing and social engineering, phishing is often considered like last year or last decade's problem. It's kind of a fixed problem. We all have spam filters. The effectiveness of sending anything by email, if you ask any kind of modern Salesforce, they'll kind of roll their eyes and say, yeah, we send a bunch of emails. Nobody ever opens or responds to emails anyway. And that's generated kind of a sense of complacency about the place of social engineering in the threat landscape in general, because it hasn't gone away. It's just moved away from email. So there's a lot of automated text messages today that lead to social engineering attacks. There's a lot of automated phone calls. And I actually saw something that's very interesting in the past couple of weeks. As some of our audience may know, there is a trend today in the world for open banking. That is, especially in the EU and Australia, you have mandates for financial institutions to open up APIs to let third-party apps interact with their online presence on behalf of customers. And what we've seen is fake mobile apps that portray themselves as financial planning apps, as finance aggregators, where victims or users download these apps with the thought that that's going to help them with tracking budgets or tracking their financials or investing. And in reality, the only purpose of these mobile apps is to steal access to the website. So you authenticate to an online banking portal, as an example, using this malicious app. The authentication goes through, and then that malicious app can use that authentication that the legitimate user just did in order to take malicious action or attack. And the social engineering here isn't pretending to be the bank. It's pretending to be a legitimate application, which the user downloads and uses of his own volition.
So we've talked a bit about how accounts get compromised, but now let's just take a moment to identify what are fake accounts, because this is another very common vector that we're seeing for fraud and abuse. So despite the name, fake accounts are real accounts, but they've been created by the fraudster in order to commit fraud and abuse on that website, on that application, on that service, for example. And it exists for that sole reason. The fraudster is attempting to extract value from that organization and that service in some way. So we talked about an example earlier about promotion abuse. We're going to look at some further examples in just a moment. But accounts are also frequently created in high numbers in order to continuously exploit the service, because for the fraudster, this is their business. They are stealing from the organization in order to fund themselves and to fund their income flow. So now let's take a moment to look at some of the potential consequences of having compromised accounts and fake accounts. So we're starting to get a broader understanding of why post-login visibility is so important for organizations. So on the compromised accounts side of things, any financial value that's stored in that account, so whether that's a credit card that's on file and then the attackers illicitly using that, whether there's just pure money, funds stored in that account that the attacker can siphon off. We also spoke about any sensitive information that's stored in that account that can also be stolen and resold. Return fraud is an interesting one that we see quite often, and then an attacker will breach an account. They will then make use of any funds or card that's on file in order to purchase goods. They'll get those goods delivered to themselves. They'll sell those goods, making a profit there. But then they'll also claim from the organization that the goods never arrived in the first place, and then try and claim the return fee refund there as well. So a multi-pronged fraudulent activity there. On the fake account side, so we've already spoken about a few examples. So promotion abuse, for example, abusing free trials by chain creating fake accounts in order to not have to pay for that service, then going a step further and selling those fake accounts to other users who don't want to pay the full amount that that service is charging. Review abuse is something that's quite common on e-commerce sites, for example, or online marketplaces where the reviews on your goods, your service are very important. So then there is incentive there for a fraudster to, for example, spam post lots of positive reviews for their own goods or services, which may not even exist. They're just trying to extract value and negatively impact other competitors on that same platform. Phishing as well. So we talked about phishing examples. Malware distribution, again, we talked about that a bit earlier, and as Uriel mentioned, that can be also used to further compromise other legitimate user accounts on that platform as well. So there are lots of different potential pain points that organizations can be experiencing as a consequence of having their accounts being compromised or by having fake accounts created on their services, on their platforms.
Alex, a lot of times people discount the problematics of people opening fake accounts. The thinking goes, I'm letting people open accounts anyway. What possible damage or what possible benefit can somebody get by opening multiple accounts? And because this is overlooked, there's in a lot of industries not really very good security controls around creating fake accounts. And the business impact can be absolutely massive. I mean, I think everybody who's listened to the news recently has heard about the problems of streaming services where their subscriber base is going down and they're struggling to show growth. Well, for those streaming services, a lot of times you can actually buy lifetime access to a streaming service for less than a month's cost, because there's an entire industry of attackers that are just constantly generating new accounts all the time just for the free trial and then reselling them constantly. And so you have an ongoing infinite free trial. But there's a lot of other kind of very subtle examples of the damage of fake accounts. So, for example, one of the companies that we worked with is a financial services company that gives accounting and invoicing services for small businesses. We've talked about the kind of lowered effectiveness of phishing attacks. Well, a lot of that has to do with modern spam filters. And what attackers have done is create fake accounts and then use the invoicing system to essentially spam and malware through the invoicing system. And because it's a highly reputable business, those invoices won't get sent into a spam trap. But there's a lot of other kinds of non-intuitive use, anything from using business intelligence information to kind of create synthetic identities or to do targeted social engineering attacks against executives of companies, to actually self-collusion. So opening an account and getting the referral fee, or opening an account and testing stolen credit cards to see if they're effective, or through laundering funds, or even in industries that have regulation against fake accounts. So, for example, the banking industry with their KYC and anti-money laundering and sanction screening regulations. Oftentimes, synthetic identities or fake identities can be stopped, but those actual KYC controls themselves are incredibly expensive. And can be a lot of damage to the actual bottom line of companies, not necessarily only by the fake accounts themselves, but by the associated cost of actually having to run those KYC and identity verification checks on a mass scale. If somebody decides to try to open 10,000 accounts in order to validate that the synthetic identity that they're creating is actually good enough.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how some traditional defenses aren't always seeing the complete picture when it comes to account security. So when we talk about traditional defenses, there are two main areas that we talk about. So we'll start off talking about solutions that operate at the point of login. So I've already mentioned a few of these. So things like MFA, login credentials themselves, 2FA, capture challenges. Now, these are really operating to see if the person who is logging in has valid credentials. They may also be looking to see, is this a real person or is this a bot that's attempting lots of concurrent logins? And it's also looking for checks like, are they able to perform that third-party verification via MFA or 2FA? The second technique or traditional defense that we talk about is something that comes a bit later in the chain. So there are solutions that operate typically at the point of transaction. So these are waiting until a fraudulent activity such as card transaction is attempted. They will look at that transaction in order to decide this is valid or not, and then they'll either submit an authorize or decline or approve decision based on the information in that specific interaction. The problem with these solutions and the gap they leave, which is why they aren't seeing the big picture, is in the middle. So between login and getting to attempted card fraud, we have this big period of time in the account that we talk about being the post-login visibility issue, where lots of activity can be taken. Now, Uriel's going to show us some of those in just a moment, but there's this big period of time and opportunity for a solution that can see what's going on there to identify post-login suspicious activity. So solutions operating at point of login can't see post-login. Solutions operating at point of transaction can't see what's happening before them. So there's this big blind spot where there's massive opportunity to have a solution that's going to catch suspicious and risky behavior, both compromised accounts and fake accounts, before we even get to the point of transaction. So I'll pass over to Uriel, who's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think, we need to kind of understand what are the scenarios by which we would want to monitor transactions after login. The first is monitoring transactions at the point of transaction, just like authorizing or declining, let's say, a credit card transaction or a peer-to-peer payment, is very problematic. The first reason it's problematic is because even handling that transaction is expensive. You have clearing fees, you have transaction fees, you have the actual cost of fraud solutions that charge, basis points off of the cost of the transaction. And so if you have attackers inundating you with fraudulent transactions, even if those transactions are then stopped at the point of the transaction itself, the stopping itself can be very, very expensive. That's why you want to stop as much of the malicious activity earlier in the funnel as you possibly can. That's why best practice is to have an anti-bot solution, because you want to stop things earlier rather than let them progress and stop them at the level of the transaction, because that becomes very, very expensive. The other reason why stopping things at the point of transactions is problematic is because you're left with a binary choice. You're left with 1 or 0, decline or allow. And once you decide that, then the cost of a false positive and the impact on both the bottom line and on the user experience is very, very harsh in case you make a mistake. And so you tend to optimize for not making mistakes, at which point you have a big opportunity cost one way or the other, right? Either you lose legitimate business or you suffer a lot of chargebacks, which can affect the business very much. The other reason why you might not want to do things on the transactional level is because there's a lot of other things that happen that have nothing to do with financial transactions or credit card transactions. For example, loyalty points, coupons, access to information itself, access to services like an internal communication system, reviews. There's a lot of abuse that can happen on an actual website that has nothing to do with the dedicated kind of fraud landscape of accept or deny transactions. And you want to be able to avoid that fraud and abuse there as well. And traditional fraud solutions haven't been able to kind of keep up with all those various use cases, both because their logic is very much dependent on the actual transaction type, and because integrating at any point in the web application is very expensive. You need to call their API, which means you need to have developers, which means you need to change your web application. And if you launch a new services offering, then you need to instrument that new service and offering as well. It's just not a very future compatible platform. Whereas our perspective is that you need to protect the entirety of what happens in the life cycle of the user in the website. And so that if you add a new service, or if you add a new offering, or if there is a new fraud pattern or an adaptation, you shouldn't need to re-instrument and redeploy a solution. It should just be able to encompass everything that happens in the website.
That's a good overview of why account security and why post-login visibility is so important. So I hope you found some really useful information in there and some other things to think about and some additional context on things to consider when you're considering account security. But now we're going to talk about how we at Human can help you to do just that. So I'd like to introduce our flagship account security product, Human Account Defender. Now, Human Account Defender safeguards online accounts from fraud and abuse. Now, it does that by detecting and neutralizing both compromised and fake accounts. So when we talk about Account Defender, there are 3 main pillars that we like to talk about. The first is seeing and stopping fraud and abuse. Now, Account Defender works by continuously evaluating accounts post-login. So it's looking at accounts after they've been taken over, for example, or after a fake account has been created, and then it's evaluating every action that's taken within that account. It's using machine learning, behavior-based risk score that is constantly reassessed and updated. So it's not just operating at the point of login or at the point of transaction or later in that chain. It's looking at every action that's taken. Is this suspicious? Is this the right person who should be within this account? Or is this account being used for exploitative purposes? The second pillar we like to talk about is reducing risk. So reducing risk to your organization, reducing risk to your customers, to your users. Account Defender helps you to respond fast without the need for manual intervention, unless you'd like to manually intervene. It's going to keep you and your customers and your organization safer with automated customizable action. So we talked about that evolving risk score. When a specific risk threshold is passed, then automated action and notification can take place. And then the final pillar is cutting investigation time. So I'm sure you're either responsible for or working on your fraud, compliance, trust and safety, identity, cybersecurity teams, and you're already juggling lots of different consoles. You're very busy. You don't want an additional time sink. Account Defender has been designed from the ground up to be the complete opposite. So it has an intuitive console that highlights the key details of an incident, so you can quickly jump in and see what took place, why it happened, any action that was taken, and then dive in for the granular details if you'd like more context on that particular incident. And it's really easy to share important information. There are a choice of pre-written, or you can create your own custom templates. So this is a screenshot we like to share because it shows some of the customizable ability of Account Defender. So what we're looking at here are things that have passed that risk threshold that I talked about, and you can see why we've highlighted the reasons for that notification to have taken place. So again, this is something that is worked on very closely with your organization. When you start to work with us, we have lots of conversations with you to really understand your pain points, how your business operates, and how we can fit into that process as seamlessly as possible and flag up the key information that's really important for your business. So for example, if you are an online marketplace, for example, you might be very specifically interested in seller abuse. Or if you're a financial organization, you may be more interested in detecting account withdrawals or illicit credit card use, those types of examples. Yoyo's going to share a few more of this now.
Yeah, so earlier when I talked about kind of having a future compatible platform, I was referring to how we, with the Human Modern Defense platform, we don't do the typical integration that typical fraud solutions do. A typical fraud solution would have the web application itself call an API at the junctures at which you want to make a yes/no decision. The problem with that is, A, you need to know in advance what are those junctures, and then if you don't think about them correctly or don't anticipate the future correctly, and those junctures change or evolve, or you have new ones, then you have to go through the development process again. And that can be incredibly costly. What the Human Modern Defense platform does is integrate actually at the network and application stack layer. So we would integrate at the CDN layer, or at the load balancer, or at the application server. And we would see all the traffic going into the website. And then we would be able to map out the API calls and the traffic that we see into the actual business actions that are taking place, which means that at one stroke, at one very simple integration that can take as little as an hour, we can instrument and see all the traffic to the website. It also means that if there is new parts of the website that involves new services, new products, we don't need to do anything additional to be able to cover them. And because we're in the flow of traffic, we can affect interventions that are more subtle and more fine-grained and more tailored to the business than just a yes, no, allow, accept, decline, allow, which allows our customers to really tailor the risk management to the business appropriate actions that you would want to take for that particular business risk.
Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples of how a detection for a fake account and then a compromised account could take place. So in this example, we're dealing with a fake account. And you can see as we start on the left-hand side, the initial account creation, it generates a very low score, in this case 0, because at this point, it could be legitimate. We just don't know until we have further information. And then you can see on the second and third account creations, we're starting to get a bit more of a score increase here, because within a short time frame, 10 minutes each, we've seen a second and a third account being created from the same device. Now that's the key thing here. The same device is being used to create all of these accounts. And then our final account creation, this is the fourth account creation that has been deployed from the same device. So at this point, it's highly suspicious. An account has been taken, action has been taken in this specific incident. Now let's look at an example of a compromised account. So again, starting on the left-hand side where we begin to monitor this account, a few things to note is that the IP country is in Germany and it's a Windows device. So again, we're starting from a score of 0 because this is where we begin monitoring the account. And then you can see later on our first incident, a few details have changed. So we're now logging in from Great Britain instead of Germany. From a Windows device, we have changed over to a Mac device. And straight away, we've seen a potentially risky action, a password reset. So we've now generated an initial score for that. Our second incident, you can see, taken a little bit later in March, is another security edit, again from this new location in this new device. So we've increased the score there. And then for our third and final action in this scenario, we can see they're trying to make another even more risky change, which is an edit to the billing details for this account. So at this point, we've decided this is a risky, suspicious activity. We think this account has been compromised and we've taken action to negate that. So a quick overview of how Account Defender works in 3 easy steps. So we begin with the detection process. So as I mentioned, Account Defender performs continuous post-login monitoring of accounts. It's looking for suspicious and risky behavior. So Uriel did a great job covering some of the examples of things it would look for. So things like, has the geographical location changed? Is one device logged into lots of different accounts? Is this a new device we've never seen before? Are they operating at speeds that no human possibly could? So we think it's an automated device that's taken over this account. So there are lots of different contextual information that's cross-referenced with each other and machine learning applied to it to make very sophisticated analysis and decisions on whether this activity is legitimate or suspicious. Then the second step in the process is getting to the intervention point. So this is where those automated customer interventions are taking place. So calling customer APIs, introducing hard blocks, redirecting to a challenge page, or whatever works with the organization's business flow. So those tend to be very tailored to the specific organization and their needs. And then our final step is using the intuitive console, so the reporting phase of this process. So it makes it very easy to quickly understand an incident. So you can dive in and see, okay, this has happened. Why did it happen? When did it happen? What were the actions that led to that being declared an incident? You can see all of that quickly and easily. If you do need to perform further investigation through your internal processes, or perhaps you're performing a manual intervention and this is part of that larger picture, you're going to get lots of contextual information in there that makes it really easy for you to see that bigger picture and feed into that overall investigation process. So will help you react more quickly and help you investigate more quickly by bubbling up that really pertinent information. And then, as I mentioned earlier, sharing information and data is also very easy. So there are template reports to choose from, and you can create your own custom reports that are really tailored to the data that your organization needs. So before I pass over to Uriel, who's going to take us through a couple of our customer use cases, I'm going to just share this great quote with you, which is from the next slide customer that we're going to talk about. So Account Defender gave us real-time detection with context-aware actions that provide immediate visibility into previously unknown account takeover attacks, enabling us to significantly reduce fraud and help desk calls. So on that high note, I'm going to pass over to Uriel.
Thanks, Alex. So this marketplace is a really good example of what I was talking earlier about modern websites having a lot more functionality than just credit card transactions. This is a website where you have people who are offering services and people who are buying services, communicating with each other directly as the website being the facilitator of that. And just the sheer breadth of different abuse that we saw with this, the sheer types of business abuse that we saw And this website is really an indicative of why you can't just have these kind of point solutions. So the simplest kind of fraud pattern that we saw was, the classic account takeover. You would have an account takeover of a seller, that's somebody who's providing services, and they have an outstanding balance or the payments that people have paid them already to render the service. And basically the attacker would just change where the funds go when they're withdrawn and withdraw the funds. And again, the typical fraud solutions with card fraud where you're making a payment aren't very useful if what you're doing is withdrawing funds. And so there wasn't very good controls for that. But you also had a huge amount of use cases around fake accounts, everything from referral fraud, where you get like compensation if you refer somebody to the website, and essentially people would refer themselves, to review fraud, where you would set up a malicious seller and then open many accounts in order to leave positive reviews for that seller so that they show up first in search results, to using the internal communication system for spam or distributing malware. And one of the most interesting things about this website is the fact that they had begun to deploy multi-factor authentication as a way around the account takeover problem. And what we saw was malware that stole access to the security token that you get once you successfully do MFA, so the session cookie, and then basically replayed it from a different device. And not only did that circumvent the security control, it actually put this customer in a particular bind, because now their standard reaction to an account takeover was to suspend the account and force a password reset. And they would do these to these compromised accounts that were compromised through malware, and it didn't help because the malware was still on the victim's machine. And so the password would be reset, and then they would just go back into the account and steal the session cookie again and do the fraud again. And this would happen 3 or 4 times. And the normal human-to-human interactions, the help desk calls, the security control, just couldn't help. And now they not only did they not know that the malware was there prior to Account Defender pointing that out, but they had to change the way their operations work in order to ensure that the victim, their customer, actually removed the malware for their machine, which is a non-trivial endeavor. A lot of malware today disable antiviruses. So it's not as simple as saying, hey, you have to install an antivirus before re-enable your account. And that was a big operational burden that we helped alleviate with automatic actions that were taking place. And then the other type, this is also a marketplace. This is not a marketplace for services. This is a marketplace for actual goods, where you have buyers and sellers buying actual goods from each other. And even here, we saw a huge amount of different scenarios that this organization had to deal with. So one example is just selling counterfeit goods. You take something that's supposed to cost $500. It costs $5 to manufacture a counterfeit, and you sell them. And they had processes in place to detect counterfeits, but you can compensate for that by sheer volume. So if you have, a control in place to check for counterfeits, and it's 90% effective, and you put in 100 counterfeit goods, 10 will still get through. And because your profit margin is 1000x times your cost, it still gives the attacker a huge return on investment to put those counterfeit goods in play. And it really hurts the brand of the marketplace that they allow this to happen. And having the human controls in place is very costly, because humans at distribution centers checking for counterfeits is very expensive, especially if you have a lot of them. And it also degrades the trust and the belief that people have in this marketplace if you can buy counterfeit goods there. But you also have other situations where you create a seller account and you offer something that is not counterfeit, but it's supposed to cost $30 and you're selling it for $500, and then you take over another person's account and use their stored credit card to buy the $30 good at $500, despite the fact that that's not what the price, the market price for that is. And then the victim might actually get real goods, but then he'll return them because he didn't actually make that order. And now the marketplace is not only stuck with refunding the actual cost of the goods, but they're also stuck with inventory that they don't need anymore. So these are kind of examples of both the varied and subtle kinds of attacks that modern web applications have, and how specific point solutions that would have said accept or decline, or just look for a card transaction or a payment transaction, just couldn't have helped. And it also underscores just how important it is for you to be able to map out and protect the entirety of the site and not just specific junctures.
Great stuff. Thanks for those real world examples, Uriel. Okay, so let me just close things off and a quick summary of everything we've talked about. So there are three main things that I want to just refresh us on that we've seen in this presentation. So first up, I hope it's become even more clear why accounts hold significant value. So it's not just money, there are lots of other things to consider as well. So free trials, coupons, and reviews are just a few additional ways that accounts can hold value. And they are critical to organizations, and they are big targets for cyber criminals and fraudsters who are looking to extract their own value from your organization. Secondly, is that the big picture matters. So as we saw earlier, traditional techniques like a login or later in the chain, like transaction, they don't see the big picture. There's a big area of post-login visibility where you need to be able to see what's happening in that account over that full life cycle and identifying suspicious and risky behavior. And the final point, of course, is that we at Human are here to help you. Human Account Defender detects and neutralizes both compromised and fake accounts with continuous post-login risk monitoring and assessment. So that's everything we had to talk about. Thank you very much for listening in.
Very good, Alex. Uriel, we've got the opportunity, as I said earlier, to take some questions from our attendees. I want to remind them, if you've got questions you haven't submitted yet, do so now via the chat window on your screen. Can't get to every question, but for those that we can answer in today's session, we'll get responses back to you via email. Gentlemen, you ready to take some questions?
Absolutely.
Sure.
The first question I have for you, what are some warning signs that an organization is experiencing compromised or fake accounts?
That's a very good question. A priori you would think, well, hold on, if it affects my bottom line, I'd know, right? Like the whole purpose of fraud is to steal money. If money is being stolen, how do I not know that? And the problem is that you want to know about it before the actual losses accumulate. And even if the losses accumulate, you don't necessarily know to attribute them to any specific thing that happens on a website. So for example, if you are a retailer and you have stores and you have a website and you have complex pattern that encompasses both, you don't necessarily know to attribute the rise in chargebacks and fraud to anything that happens on the website. So it's really critical that you have early warning systems in place. And that's kind of why visibility is important beyond mitigation. But some of the signs can be like a massive increase in help desk calls, people complaining about receiving emails for accounts that they never created, a rise in transaction reversals, a rise in inquiries, a peak in actual unplanned transactions. Like if you normally have X logins a day and you suddenly have 10 X logins a day, if you have an increase in transaction volume without a proportional increase in revenue, even such things as infrastructure costs. I mean, we've seen situations where some customers were oblivious to the breadth of their security challenge, but once we got involved, we saw that something like 90% of their web traffic was bots. And just blocking the bots reduced their infrastructure costs by a huge amount.
Uriel, what are the differences between detecting a fake account versus a compromised account?
So there's big differences both in how you would go about detecting them and how you would go around mitigating the risk. If you look at an account takeover, it's actually a much simpler problem to solve because you have a history of this user. And so you can look for things like profile deviation. Is this user acting differently than how they did in the past? And you can leverage that history in order to say, hey, this is anomalous, this is risky, this is different. I want to take a mitigating action here. And also, because there is a difference between the real user and the attacker, you can take relatively simple and harmless measures to mitigate. For example, suspending the account and forcing a password reset, or escalating to multi-factor authentication, or putting a transaction on hold until manual review, or calling a user and validating the transaction. I mean, there's really a lot of things and a lot of leeway you have. The problem with fake accounts is that they're both harder to detect and harder to mitigate. They're harder to detect because you don't have history. And if you're looking at statistical analysis, you're not comparing people to their past behavior because they just created the account, right? So you have no history to go on. You're comparing them to their peer groups. And depending on your website and your web application, peer groups can be very heterogeneous. Not all people are alike. The second problem is that you don't really have a good way, a big portfolio of actions that you can take to mitigate. So it's not like you can force a password reset. The person who opened the account is the attacker. If you ask them to reset their password, they'll reset their password and they'll continue. If you ask them for multi-factor authentication, they'll just answer that multi-factor authentication because they are the actual person who opened the account. And this gets a lot worse because you have situations like the European Union regulation from 2019, 1150, which means that you can't just close accounts. You have to give people the ability to address grievances and redress. And so you can't just arbitrarily block accounts that you suspect are malicious. You have to have an operational burden associated with that, which further limits your options about what actions can take place in that situation.
Very good. I'm going to get in some more questions here before we wrap up, and I get an immediate follow-up for you. Okay, I've detected a fake or compromised account. What do I do next?
Well, this is kind of, I think, where security controls have failed businesses in the past because they've taken security actions rather than business actions. And multi-factor authentication, it sounds like we're ganging up on multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is not a bad thing, but it's completely divorced from the business, and there is no appropriate business action. What we at Human believe is that the action needs to be tailored to the actual business risk. And a big advantage of that is that you're not necessarily providing a feedback loop to attackers. So if you take like a certain hard-coded action as a reaction to a certain scenario, you're giving information to the attacker that they can adapt against. So if the attacker knows that if I make a payment over X amount, I will be challenged with an out-of-bound phone call, then they can plan accordingly, either going under the limit or figuring out a way to get access to that phone call. We think that the actual action that needs to take place needs to be tailored to what the attacker is attempting to achieve. So I'll give you an example. One of our customers is a petition signing website, and their form of abuse is one person signing the same petition 1,000, 10,000 times. And that undermines the reliability of the entire petition website. What we do there is we just compile a list of all the fraudulent signatures, and then in a batch process that happens once an hour, all those fraudulent signatures are removed from the database. And so the attacker going in and tries to sign the petition, they sign the petition, they look at it, it's signed, it's there. They don't get any feedback loop, and it just disappears after the fact.
Uriel, what kind of automated actions can one take to respond to a threat?
Well, I think this goes back to what Alex was talking earlier about alert fatigue. Everybody who's operating an organization now has alert fatigue. You have SOCs, you have fraud team, they're inundated with a variety of solutions, and they can't keep up with the demand of all the different alerts they have and all the different systems they have. And I think the important thing that we need to consider is the importance of self-service. That is allowing legitimate users an ability to redeem themselves and allowing basically attackers to foil themselves. So there are a lot of good ways to do that. Suspending an account and putting a password reset email can be a perfectly legitimate response to an account takeover that just removes attackers earlier on in the funnel and doesn't put operational burden on the fraud team for transactions to review. Likewise, taking a transaction and putting it on hold, or validating it using an automated phone call out of band and without giving any kind of indication on the website, both gives you an advantage against that feedback loop that I was talking about, but still gives an automated way to do that. You can also take very expensive measures like knowledge-based authentication out of wallet questions and only apply them to very, very high-risk situations, which makes them financially feasible.
Now, how long does it take to implement Account Defender? And next question, how difficult is it to integrate?
So I think this is one of the revolutionary things that we've done with Account Defender, in that we've moved away from that paradigm of actually changing the web application, having you call a variety of APIs, to doing that for you. So to get into a monitor-only deployment of Account Defender can take as little as an hour. Let's say you have a CDN, we install an edge worker that gives us the traffic. That takes about an hour of integration, and then we kind of see the entire traffic of the website, and we can be on our way and building profiles and getting detection. And you can have real production alerts and detection in as little time as a week after deployment. Of course, once you start taking mitigating action, that becomes a bit more complicated, and you have to be more sensitive to the friction that it introduces to your users and the business needs. But we can be up and running in less than a month, showing value and showing return on investment.
Follow up. I'm already using a suite of management tools. Does my team need to manage another tool with Account Defender?
Yeah, I call that the single pane of glass problem. I mean, if I'm a security guard and I have to look at one television set or have to look at 10,000, I still have the same attention span. And so more things are going to get through if I have to split my attention on 10,000 monitors. And this is why one of our core beliefs in Human is to be open and compatible. We don't own your data, you own your data. And we believe very, very strongly in the ability to export all the information that we hold to you, our customer, and to third-party solutions, whether that's real-time notifications, whether that's aggregation of metrics to things like Datadog, or mass exporting of the database to things like Splunk, or even offering like a real-time database view into our database, like using Google BigQuery view or Snowflake, or even opening tickets in third-party applications like Jira when a high-risk activity occurs. It's critical to be open and compatible in today's world, because no one solution is the end-all, be-all of the security landscape. And I think fraud solutions, especially in the past, have a very bad reputation of being black boxes, where you don't know what exactly goes inside, you can't fiddle and play with it, and what you get is what you have, and that's it. And that's very far from what we believe our solutions should be.
Final question. It's a devil's advocate question. Why should I buy a third-party solution like Account Defender? I know my organization, I know my market, and I can develop an in-house solution.
I mean, the standard out-of-the-box question for that is that the core competency of your business? And should that be how you're investing your money? But a lot of businesses that say yes, yeah, security and reliability and the trust that we have in our brand is a differentiator that we have in the market. But you still have the problem of scale. So we at Human, we have a huge breadth of traffic and customers and fraud patterns that we've seen. And a lot of the strength of our detections comes from the network effect, the fact that we can spot like a fraudulent actor on one customer and then recognize them when they go into another customer. And that's one of our core values of shared intelligence and shared detection. And no matter how big you are, and no matter how knowledgeable you are, just applying your knowledge and your analytics to your data set means that you're behind the curve, because attackers attack multiple destinations on multiple websites, and they share information between yourself. And if you're in a silo, you're already starting way behind where you would be if you were part of a greater network that has economy of scale.
Very good. Here we go, Alex. Thank you so much for your time, for your insight. Thank you for answering these questions as well. Also want to thank our attendees, of course, for taking time out of your day. We appreciate that you did give us this time, and I do trust that our conversation today provided some excellent new insight, some excellent new data points to enable you and your organization to be better prepared to tackle the challenges we discussed here today. I look forward to seeing you again at one of our upcoming sessions. And until then, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you for your time and attention today.